Yo, what up? Guys, welcome. Thank you for coming out to CenCal Dreamin. It's a really awesome event. I'm super excited to be presenting again for the second time. I'm happy to be accepted as a speaker again. But yeah, today we're going to be talking all about refactoring flows. More specifically, refactoring a really crappy flow that I made really early on in my Salesforce days. So before we kind of get into this more, my name's Jake Aguilar. You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. I work for Bitwise Technology Consulting, and I serve as a Salesforce administrator there. And Brad already kind of mentioned a little bit when he was introducing me, but basically, I think presentation-wise, we're good to go. So let's go ahead. All right. So just a really quick bit about me. I've been in the ecosystem for about a little over 2 years now. It's been an amazing 2 years. I knew nothing about Salesforce coming into this. I went from just like Melissa was saying, and actually in the podcast, that I was taking coding classes and I thought coding was really cool. And then Brad had mentioned earlier today where you could spend like hours making a nav bar, and then I got introduced to Salesforce and learned how we can build applications within a matter of weeks that are just fully fledged applications, and kind of boggled my mind how hard yet easy it was. So, but yeah, I spent about 2 years in the ecosystem now. I work with various clients in various industries, nonprofits, commercial and residential realty, co-working, education, as well as security. And Brad also did mention when I was introducing me, 10-time certified. My hardest earned certifications I've done so far: the application architect, platform developer one, which was not easy, and then I just most recently got my nonprofit certification, and I have sales, service, and experience cloud consultant certifications as well. But let's kind of just dive in. So before we kind of get into the flow that we're going to rebuild together, I kind of want to go over some best practices when developing flows. The first one that I always I preach to students as well, because I have taught Salesforce admin classes as well, is document, describe in detail just what the heck you're doing in a flow. When you are building flows, you're not going to be the only one maintaining this over time. You're going to eventually, you might move on to other projects, who knows, other companies, other admins and developers are going to come behind you and update these flows. And it's really important that it's similar to commenting your code. You should always document what the heck your flow is doing, as well as each step during the flow. What is this thing doing? What is that thing doing? So on and so forth. And then one thing as well is be consistent in how you name your variables. If your company already has a standard and how you develop flows, follow those standards. If you don't have a standard, then you should consider making one. And that way you can use a standard going across all your flows. So if you're going to camel case your variable names, do that. Just whatever standard you decide to adopt, stick with it. Second point here, we call it discrete units of work. And I don't know if you were watching Evan Ponter's presentation on flows today, which is also fantastic. He kind of touched on this a fair bit as well. When you're building a flow, and it kind of just depends on how complicated and complex the flow is. When you're building a flow, making sure all these steps, like let's say we're updating contact records or opportunities or accounts. When we build a flow, making sure all your contact stuff is one section of your flow, and then go so on and so forth. And finally, from there, let's move on to decisions. Whenever we are retrieving records from Salesforce from the database, making sure you have a decision element that's checking, hey, did we actually grab some records from Salesforce? And if so, okay, let's proceed. I think we all know this, but don't hard code IDs and flows. IDs change from environment to environment. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, it's just always a bad practice to hard code IDs. Do not put DML in loops. I was super guilty of this early on, so we're going to fix some of that today. Use fault paths whenever you can. fault paths are a great tool you can use to basically, if something goes wrong when retrieving records or updating records, maybe you send an error email to the admin team or yourself when that happens. That way you can go and debug what happened. Subflows when available. Not all types of flows can use subflows yet. I'm looking at you, record triggered flows. But when you do have the ability to use subflows, use them. Think of them as like smaller function flows that you can call from another flow. They speed up your development time. They're easier to maintain, as if you don't have to go to update every single flow that uses that same functionality. You can just go update one flow and boom, you're done. All the other flows are going to update with it. And finally, when you're building brand new flows, use the debug tool. Just recently, Salesforce, with the newest release, allows you to debug record triggered flows, which was always a pain in the butt to debug in the past, but now we can. But use the debug tool, especially when you can debug it on the canvas and you can see the fault paths, you can see where everything goes. But enough about best practices. Let's move on to our culprit for today. This is a process and flow built by yours truly. And this is a monstrosity of a flow and process. I don't know what the heck I was doing, obviously. I look back at it now and I just cringe super hard. But let me kind of tell you a bit about what this process and flow is supposed to do. So we, at Bitwise, we lease a lot of spaces out to tenants. And we wanted to track, hey, if a tenant is renting a space or leasing out a space, we want to know on the space record itself, who's the tenant of that space currently. And then, so whenever a lease status expired, we launch this flow. Whenever a lease status is active, we launch this flow. So basically, we were checking if the lease status changed, launch this flow and do its thing. Now, the flow on that part, basically, that's what was doing all the magic behind the scenes. And truth be told, after testing this flow recently, I found it didn't even work the way I wanted it to in the beginning. So I'm not sure what the heck I was doing. But basically here you can see we have DMLs and loops. It's just, it's not pretty. I'm sorry for those who are watching. I'm sure you're cringing in your seats, but we're going to fix this today. That's just the great part about it. So just so you know a little bit about what we're going to be doing in this flow, it's kind of important to understand this as well. This is a data model that we're kind of working with so far, at least in this flow. So we have one account. This could be a company that's leasing a space. And that company can have multiple leases over their lifetime. It can also have multiple leases concurrently for different buildings. They also, this is where we wanted to see which company had which spaces just on the account record. And so we have a lookup from space to account, just so we can see, hey, which spaces are occupied by which companies or accounts. And finally, we have like a pseudo junction object between lease and space. They're not master details, they're just lookups. And it's basically, we have a junction object called lease space. Is there a better name? Maybe, but that's what we decided at the time, and we're sticking with it. But without further ado, I think we have enough here of me talking. Let's go ahead and I'm going to get right into building a flow, and we'll go from there. So I have this brand new flow now. This is going to be a record triggered flow because I want to replace the process that was launching that flow to begin with and handle all the logic that the flow was handling in the first place. So my first step is I need to update this start node to say, hey, this flow needs to launch whenever a lease changes. So I need to find my lease object and find that. Now here, I can say, hey, what conditions do I want to trigger this automation? And what I want to do is, since our process was triggering whenever the lease status changed, that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to find the status field, and this is on the lease object. And whenever, do or as well. Whenever this status, wait, that's not what I'm doing right now. I want lease, and then there we go. After record is saved, creator updated. That's what I want as well. Condition requirements, and whenever the status field, it's changed and it's true. So I am triggering this flow whenever the status field changes on the lease record. Now that's my first step. The next thing I need to do is I need to get the lease space records, which is that junction object that we kind of had between spaces and lease. I need to get all those records that are related to my triggering lease record. So I'm going to go ahead and drag get records on the canvas. I'm going to call it get lease spaces. I think that makes sense. And this kind of going back to my first point, whenever building flows, document what the heck you're doing. So I'm going to say this is created by me. Purpose, let's say, what I want to say, grabbing all the lease space records from the triggering that lease record. Perfect. Now I need to tell it what object, what kind of records I want to grab. I want to find lease space. There we go. And now I need to say, hey, what lease space records do I want to grab? And I want to grab the lease space records where the lease is equal to our triggering lease record. And so I'm going to do this and find the ID. So boom. Now I'm grabbing every lease space record where the lease is equal to the lease that just changed. And finally, I want to get all the lease spaces because it's possible that a company can lease multiple spaces at once. Perfect. And I'm going to leave this the way it is for now. Perfect. Now I have my first node set up. I'm grabbing those lease space records from the lease. Now, a best practice I also mentioned before too is I need to do a decision to check if there were indeed lease spaces attached to that record. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to say lease. I'm going to call it lease spaces found. Let's go with that. Boom. Created by myself. Purpose. Let's do determine if there were indeed space records from the triggering lease. And now I'm going to kind of define my outcomes. And so here I'm going to say, let's say lease spaces found. And I can't have that since it's already API name, so I'm just going to camel case this. Oh my God, I cannot type there. All right, so I have one here. I'm going to do another outcome. I'm going to do lease spaces not found. And I'll keep it consistent with my other one. All right, so now I need to define the actual conditions for this. And so what I can do is I can say, hey, go look at that collection variable, which from before when we got all the lease spaces, it should give me a whole bunch of lease spaces attached to that lease. So I can check if this lease space collection variable is null. And if it is null, or if it's not null, then I want to proceed. And then let me go do the other one. Lease spaces is null, true. So I'm checking, hey, if that collection variable is null, then this is that outcome. And if there were lease spaces on the lease, then this is that outcome. And finally, I'm going to rename the default outcome. I'm just going to call it unhandled outcome. And basically, I use this as a way to debug whenever I'm doing flows. Basically, if a flow ever takes this outcome during my debugging session, I know, oh, I didn't think of every possible outcome that there is. I need to go back to my decision and rethink how things are going. So boom, I have this all set up now. I'm checking if there were actually lease spaces attached to that record. I'm going to go ahead and attach this to my flow. I'm going to move on. So one thing that we realized and by we, I mean me, that we realized when building this flow is it is very hard to grab records on the other side of a junction object, meaning I wanted to grab the actual space records that were on my lease space records I just got. And it's pretty hard to do that in Flow as of right now. So we made an Apex action to do this for us. That basically we pass it a list of lease spaces, and we're telling the Apex, hey, can you go get me all the space records that the other parent of these records are? And so that's what we're going to do right now. I'm going to drag on this Apex action. Let me go find it real quick. I believe it's called leasing helper. There it is. All right. As soon as this loads. Any day. There we go. So now I'm just going to say, hey, I want to get the space records from my lease space collection. So I'm going to call it get spaces from lease spaces created by myself, purpose. The name kind of says it, but I'm just going to say grab the space, capitalize space into the object. Okay. Grab the space records from the lease space collection. All right. Now there's a couple things I need to do here to actually make this Apex action work. One, I need to pass a collection of all the lease spaces I previously retrieved. So, boom, that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm passing Apex now. Hey, here's the lease spaces I want you to work with. And then finally, I have a variable I need to set to get all the space records back from the Apex action. So I'm going to make a new resource real quick. I'm going to call it space record collection. That way I know, just by looking at this name, hey, this is a collection of all the space records I got from the Apex action. And then I'm just going to call this, I'm going to make it a record variable. I'm going to find the space object. Where are you? There you are. And I'll make it available for input and allow multiple values. Perfect. So now I'm capturing all the space records that it's going to give back to me. Perfect. I'm done here. I'm going to close that out and connect this up. And I'm going to say, if lease spaces were found, I want to proceed. So perfect. Admins, you know my pain. I hate the crooked lines and flows. I also don't like the auto layout mode. So that's just me. I don't know. Leave me alone. All right. So now I have my first 3 nodes down. Now I need to go through and loop through all my space records that I just retrieved. And so I'm going to go ahead and drag on a loop element. I'm going to call it through space records. And now I'm looping through all the space records I just retrieved from that Apex action. And basically what I want to do here now is if the space record, if the lease's status is active, I want to set the tenant lookup on the space record to that tenant. And if it's expired, I want to clear out that lookup so we know that space is available. So I'm going to go ahead and say loop through the retrieve space records and determine if the tenant lookup needs to be set or set to null. All right, now I need to tell it, hey, what record do I want to loop? What record collection do I want to loop through? And I want to loop through all the space records I just got. So perfect. And direction doesn't really matter with this. Now, if you're paying attention to my previous flow when I was using DML statements or the purple pink icons in the loop, you know that's bad practice. We never want to have DMLs inside of a loop. And the reason for that is you're going to run into governor limits very quickly, and it's just bad practice. It's very inefficient. So what we're going to do now is instead of having all these update records in the loop, I'm going to use assignment nodes instead. So let me go back to my flow. Now, the way I like to compare using loops is imagine you just learned how to drive. You got your license, you're super excited to go out with your buddies, you want to go to the movie theaters or wherever, you want to go hang out somewhere. But usually when you learn how to drive, your parents ask you to go do favors for them. hey, can you go to the grocery store? Can you go to the store? I need something. Cool. And you're kind of excited to drive, so you don't mind doing that anyway. So you're like, all right, what do you need from the grocery store? And they tell you, all right, I need some milk. All right, cool. You go to the grocery store, you buy some milk, you come back with the milk, and then your parent says, all right, now I need some flour. And you're like, all right, why didn't you just tell me before? Cool. All right, I'll go back to the grocery store. Maybe you just forgot to tell me. You go back to the grocery store, you get your flour, and you come back to the house, and then I was like, all right, now I need some eggs. And now you're just like, okay, hold on here. What are you doing to me? I am wasting gas going to the grocery store doing all these trips, when instead you should just give me a list of all the things to do, all the things you want me to grab at the grocery store. Same thing when we're doing updating records in set of flows. We want to build a list of records that we want to update and then do it all at once. And so we want to bulkify this. So that's what we're going to do right now. So I have my loop. I'm telling it what records I want to loop through. Now let's go ahead and actually learn a better way to do this today from Evan, but I'll stick with my plan for now. Let's call it, I'm going to call this lease status. So basically, I'm just determining what is the status of the lease. And so I'm just going to say created by myself, purpose, determine lease status of the triggering lease record, and if active, at the tenant lookup on the space record to the account ID, and if null and if expired, and set the tenant lookup to null. All right, let's go ahead and build these outcomes. So I'm going to call this active for our lease status, and I'll just adjust the API name here real quick. Lease status active. We got another one here. Let's do scheduled, since we have a scheduled status. And then let me go ahead and adjust this. And finally, we have an expired for an expired lease. And let me go and set that as well. All right, so now let me set the conditions. I need to determine if the triggering record, which is our lease record, I need to look at the status. And if the status is active, then I'm going to go do something. And same thing with scheduled. I'm going to go find the record. Let me go find the status. And if it equals scheduled, cool, I'm going to go do something. Same thing with the status for expired. Perfect. And then I'll call this unhandled outcome. So perfect. I have my decision element now, and I'm able to determine what the status of the lease is. And depending on the status, I'm going to go do a couple different things. So I'm going to click done. Now, one thing I learned from Evan's presentation on flows earlier that I don't make too much use of, though I did, it made sense when he was talking about it, is using formulas instead. This would be a perfect use case for using a formula to determine the status of the lease. I can have a formula saying if the status of the lease is this, do this, and then I can assign values from there. But we'll stick with my game plan for now, and we'll go from there. So perfect. So now I have my decision, and I'm looping through each space record that we previously retrieved. Now I need to say, all right, if the status of the lease is active, I need to set the tenant lookup on the space record to that tenant. So let me go ahead and do that. I'm going to drag an assignment node, and I'm going to call it assign tenant to space. Created by myself, purpose, purpose, there we go. Set the tenant lookup on the space record to the account ID. All right. And now what I'm doing here is I need to go grab the current item we're being looped through. And then I need to, let me do this. I need to find the tenant lookup. That's this. And I need to set it equal to the lease's tenant. So if I go back to my triggering lease record, which is that $ record variable, this is that lease record that kicked off this whole flow. And on the lease, it makes sense that, hey, this lease is attached to a company somewhere. So we call that a tenant here as well. And so I'm just setting the tenant from the lease onto the tenant lookup on the space record. Perfect. I have that down. Let me go ahead and do this. I'm gonna say, hey, this is for the active outcome. Boom, boom. Let me organize this a little bit more. All right, so now I have my active outcome. Now let me do the expired outcome. So I'm gonna do assignment again. Let's say empty tenant on space. I know this is really tedious, but those who come by behind you and update this flow will appreciate you. Set the tenant lookup on space record to null. And all I'm doing here, I'm going to go check my current item in here. I'm going to find a tenant lookup, and then I'm going to set it equal to no value. I'm just going to leave this blank. Perfect. And this is for my expired outcome, because if the lease expires, that means that company is no longer leasing that space. So they shouldn't be on the space record to begin with. So let me go ahead and set that to expired. Perfect. So now I have this all set to go. Let me organize this a little bit more. All right. Let me do this right here. And good enough. All right. So now, kind of what I talked about before with our list analogy, I want to assign all these updated space records to a collection so I can update them later. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I have one more assignment, and I'm going to say assign to updated collection. And created by myself. Purpose. Assign to updated space record collection for later update. And now I just need to make a new collection. So I'm going to go ahead and make that real quick. I'm making a variable, and I'm going to call it updated space record collection. And this is a collection. I'm going to do this, data type record, and I am storing space variables inside here, or space records. So I need to find space, wherever the heck it is. Hello. Why is it not coming up? Oh, right down there. All right, and boom. So I have my new collection variable that I'm going to use to later update all my space records at once. And then I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to add the current item we're processing in this loop. Boom. Done. And then I'm going to connect these up. So I have my decision in here now. Again, we could do this with the formula, but I'm sticking with my game plan for now. And I'm going to put that back to the loop. So now we have a loop that's going to process every space record that we got. If the status of this lease is active, set the tenant lookup on the space to that tenant. If it's expired, empty out that lookup, and then we're going to process every record like that. And finally, we're going to update all these records at once. Update space records by myself. Purpose. Update the space records, the updated space record collection. Now I'm telling it here, hey, do I want to use the lease record that triggered this flow? Do I want to use specific ID to update a record, or do I want a record collection, or do I want to specify conditions? I already have a collection of space records I want to update, so I'm going to choose this middle option. And here I can find, hey, there's my updated collection. So now once I do this, boom, connect that up. Our flow for the most part is done now. We have all the functionality we want. I'm grabbing lease spaces. I'm determining, hey, were there actually lease spaces on this lease, which there always should be, but just in case. I'm grabbing the space records from those lease spaces. I'm processing them, and I'm finally updating them at the end. Now, some of the another best practice that we should do is using fault paths. Fault paths are a way where you can trigger where you can trigger an email to go to your admin or your admin team and saying, hey, something went wrong with this flow. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. I'm just going to find a send email. I think this is sufficient enough for now. Again, you can get as fancy with this as you want. Flow error email. And now my body, let's say I need to make a new resource. I'm just going to make it really quick and dirty. I'm going to say error message. And then I'm setting this equal to global flow variable. Perfect. So I have my error message here now. Let's just say flow error. Again, you can get as fancy with this as you want. And since this is for our internal org, we have a whole email distribution group our whole admin team uses. So I'm going to go ahead and use that here. Salesforce support at bitwiseindustries.com. And perfect. Good enough for now. I just want to show you what we should do. And now finally, so let's say in the very beginning that for some reason, a lease has no lease spaces. I don't know what the heck they're renting, but they have no lease spaces. All right. If something like that happens, then I'm sending an email to our admin team. Hey, something went wrong with this flow. And then from there, we can further look into it and debug and see what happened with whomever from the leasing department is trying to use this flow. So for the most part, this flow is done. I have all the functionality I want. I'm updating space records depending on the lease status. I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now, going back to a best practice as well, just with flows in general, we should only be having one source of automation per object, and with flows being the with flows being the new automation tool that's going to be pushed forward, like Evan said before in his presentation, workflow rules and processes, they're kind of going out the window. Flows are going to soon be able to do everything that every workflow rules and processes can do, if not already. I know with workflow rules, we're still waiting on the ability to send outbound messages in Flow, which is coming soon from what I saw on the roadmap. But I'm going to go ahead and name this, let's do lease create/update. So this is a record trigger flow on the lease object, and we're using on create/update. And we'll put my initials here just so people know who made the flow. And let's go ahead and save this. And I'm going to activate it. Cool. So I have my flow. It's ready to go. Now let's test it. Let's see if what I built here works. So first, I'm going to hit debug. And this is a new feature with record trigger flows as of the latest release. You can now debug record trigger flows, which is amazing. But now here, let's find a lease record we already have in Salesforce, and we're going to debug it. So when I click run, it tells you the path that the whole flow takes. It tells you, hey, I found lease records, and you can see all the details here on the right. All right, lease spaces were found. I went to the action. I found some space records, and I'm looping through them. I can see the status of the lease was active, so it set all the lookups in those space records to that lease's tenant. And then finally, at the end, we updated all the space records. Now, one thing important to know when you're debugging record trigger flows is you'll notice that the flow runs in rollback mode. Basically, what this means is all the actions that you just did in your flow, they were rolled back to what they were previously. That way, you're not updating your database accidentally. Well, let's go test this out real quick. So I have here's my lease record in Salesforce. This is for Bitwise Industries, a primary contact. For some reason, this is myself. I'm not sure why Bitwise Industries put me in charge of this, but whatever. The building I'm leasing out of is Bitwise South Stadium. You can see the start date, the end date, whole bunch of stuff. And you can see here on the right, here's all the spaces I'm leasing out of Bitwise South Stadium. Now, what would happen if I were to set this status to active? So let me go show you before we do anything. Here is all the suites I'm leasing out currently with Bitwise Industries. You can see here they're all occupied. Here's all the suites. So let's go back to our lease and let's update it. So here I'm going to we update the start date. I believe we have some sort of automation on the status. That's why I'm doing this this way as well. So I want to say the expiration is already over. Let's do, actually it should be this. All right, so now the status of this lease is expired. If I go check on my suites, if I refresh this, all the tenants are gone now. So our flow works. It makes sense. I'm following best practices now. I'm not using this monstrosity of a flow to do things that didn't work in the first place. I think that is it. Is that all I had? Yep, that is it. Sweet. I'm going to open up the questions. I think we have 3 minutes left. So if anyone has any quick questions, go ahead. If not, sweet. All right. Cool. We got a question. Madri says, are there any limitations when using the debug tool for Refactoring Flows? I just mentioned one about the rollback mode, which is honestly, in my opinion, good. So you're not updating your database as you're doing this stuff. So that's one limitation, depending on what you consider limitation. But in terms of the debug tool, with the newest release, now there isn't. Before, you couldn't even debug Refactoring Flows. The way I did it before, you can debug them, was I converted it to an auto launch flow. I had to add some couple nodes to get the records I wanted, and then I had to debug from there. So now you don't have to do that on any of that mumbo jumbo. It's all done within the same flow, and it works pretty well. I don't have any complaints about it so far. Great question, though. Celine asks, what is the most challenging part of flows in your opinion? What is the most challenging part of flows? Honestly, I think it comes down to the use case. Basically, whenever you're building a flow, it's sometimes hard to think through all the automations that you need to do, all the actions you need to take during a flow. So one of the things I do when kind of just planning for a flow is just writing it out in plain English. What needs to happen when something in Salesforce happens? So if I needed to document this flow, or maybe I was in a discovery meeting, they said, hey, we want this to happen whenever this lease status changes. Basically, I could think of best practice to document this in plain English. All right, my users want this to happen, and when this happens, and when you start documenting that out, you'll find yourself almost kind of pseudo coding, like, hey, I'm writing all the steps I need to take during this flow. And eventually, when you have that blueprint, it's pretty easy to build the flow. You kind of realize, oh, I have all the steps kind of outlined for me. Honestly, the most challenging part is just realizing what action you need to take sometimes. And then once you have a blueprint, though, you're usually pretty much good to go. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. Subflow. really quick. Subflow is think of it as another flow you can call from a flow. Flowception, baby. But I use subflows as a think about it as like small functions you can do within flows, and I call other flows from that. If you're developing, think of it as almost like trigger and trigger handlers. You can call a trigger handler class from a trigger. And then I think I am out of time. If you guys have any more questions, though, feel free to find me, and I'm going to be in one of the admin drop-in lounges, so feel free to find me. I can answer your questions there as well.